Hello again everybody. This video will be a bit different from the ones you may have seen me do before. I thought I'd show you how I use Excel in my guitar building. There'll actually be two videos. This one, the one you're going to see, is about basically a spreadsheet, which is an information sheet, which I keep around the whole time when I'm building and I refer to all the time. Contains a load of useful information during the build process, stuff which you need to have around but you can't keep in your head, or at least I can't. The second video will be about a second spreadsheet which I created to use in conjunction with a rig I invented, which you may have seen before in a previous video, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. The rig measures the nut and saddle compensation for an instrument, guitar or ukulele, whatever it is, and the values that come out of that second spreadsheet, some of them are input into the one you're going to see now, but it warrants a separate video. I think the video will be too long and complicated if I tried to squeeze them both in. So the worksheet, or the workbook you're going to see today, actually started just as a very simple fret calculator. So calculating fret distances given a scale length. But over the years it kind of snowballed as I added more and more useful information which I needed around me while I was building. If you know Excel, none of this will be terribly, unfamiliar or exciting. It's no great shakes really. If you don't, on the other hand, then maybe it would look very complex and intimidating to start with. I hope not. I try and show what goes into it and what comes out, and I hope you'll be able to see why it could be useful. It's not perfect, I'm sure. It's just stuff which I found to be handy. Anyway, enough talking for now. Let's get into it. And I hope you enjoy it. So here we are in Excel, and this is the sheet that I'm looking at when I'm sawing frets. But you can see there's an awful lot of information on it, and I use it for a lot more than simply knowing where to put the fret slots. But it started off as a very simple spreadsheet, just given a scale length to calculate where the frets should go. And the first thing I'll show you in a moment is that part of it, because it's still the core of it, if you like. I built it probably 10 years ago, and it's sort of developed over time into what it is now, which is basically a sort of information sheet which I have stuck on my wall whenever I'm building a guitar, and it's got a lot of handy dimensions and things which I might forget. And I can just refer to it really quickly and easily. But for now, the next thing I'll show you is, as I say, the heart of it, which is just the part where I enter a scale length. I tell it what scale length I want, and then it calculates the positions of the fret slots for that scale length. Here we are in the most basic part of the spreadsheet then. And you can see at the top left, I've highlighted a cell where I'm going to enter the scale length in millimeters. And you'll see the fret sizes being calculated in this column here. Next to that cell, there's just for information the equivalent in inches of the value I enter. And you'll see a number of other green coloured cells below this one. And if you look at this rather loud reminder in above it, you'll see that I've set the thing up so that cells where I need to enter values are coloured green, and everything else on the sheet is basically done by Excel. So already that might make the sheet seem a little bit less complex, because you'll see I've only got a few cells here where I enter data, and there's a few more on the right which are obscured for the moment. We'll come on to those in a bit. But there isn't really that much data that I have to enter, and Excel does all the work, really. So I'm going to enter an arbitrary scale length, let's just say 632, just because I can. I can enter any value I want, down to ukulele scale length or up to bass guitar. And there we go, you can see all the fret lengths, fret sizes calculated in this column here. The length I entered, scale length, happens to be equivalent to 24.9 inches. That's, as I said, just for information. Here I've just unhidden the column next door to the fret size column, and you can see that this is just the same data presented as distances from a single reference point, the nut, which is obviously how you actually use the data in practice. So that this is basically the data I'm looking at when I'm sawing fret slots. The one next to it I won't unhide for now, but the reason that this is headed nominal is because these are distances from where the nut would be at its nominal position, so without any forward shift. A few years ago I started looking into the idea of compensating the nut, which certainly wasn't my idea. Some people have done some work on it before. And I built myself a jig which can measure for a particular string at whatever scale length you're going to use, and a certain playing action. It measures the amount of compensation needed at the saddle end and also at the nut end. And compensating the nut, I found, has a quite dramatic effect on the intonation in the lower frets. So for me, at any rate, it's definitely worth doing. So I measure the compensation needed at both ends for all 6 strings at the scale length I'm going to be using in the current build, and I put those values into a second spreadsheet, which will be the subject of another video. The jig I built, I rather vaingloriously christened GNASHER, which is an acronym involving my name. I may put the explanation on the screen. And so this second spreadsheet, of course, I had to name Dennis, and I shoehorned a possible acronym for that. So basically I have a system called Dennis and GNASHER. UK readers of the Beano comic may obviously understand why I had to do that. Anyway, the end result of that process is a single figure, which is the amount I need to move the nut forward from its nominal position to get the best intonation at the lower frets. And it's normally a millimetre or 2. So what I'm going to do is unhide the column next to this yellow column you're seeing now, which is fret distances from the nominal nut position, so without any compensation. And you'll see that the new values are simply the same data, but from the compensated nut position. Here it is. You can see it's labelled with compensation as opposed to the nominal figures, and at the moment they're identical to the nominal figures, and that's because I haven't got any figure entered in this cell here for the nut offset. So I'm just going to enter an arbitrary figure now of 2 millimeters, and you'll see these figures now change to reflect the distances of the frets from the compensated nut position. So the first fret with 2 millimeters compensation is 2 millimeters shorter than it would have been from the nut in its nominal position, and the same for all the other frets. Now I guess you can begin to see why I've shaded the labels next to these cells a different color. I've put a reminder that I get these figures from my Dennis spreadsheet. So when I've done the process of measuring all the 6 strings, the compensation nut and saddle end, I put that data into the Dennis spreadsheet, and I can get various figures back out. And the one we're dealing with here is the nut offset. I'll tell you about the others, but first I should explain what these letters here mean, just so you can make sense of the labels. So here in the center of the sheet you can see a little box where I've explained the abbreviations I've used just to save space in the cell labels themselves. So you can see things like front of bridge, front of saddle, scale length, and so on. So now you can see that the information I put in here is the distance of the front of the bridge to the scale length. So how far forward the bridge is from the scale length, in other words, and the distances behind the scale length that the saddle is at its first string position and 6th string position, because the saddle is set behind the scale length, of course. So these two figures give me the slope of the saddle and its position on the bridge. But finally, going back to sawing fret slots, these are the figures I use when I'm actually cutting them, using my jig, which I can set to these exact figures. It's accurate to the nearest 1/10 of a millimeter. And so that's what I'm looking at when I'm sawing frets. I'm going to enter some reasonable figures in these cells. I haven't actually used Dennis, we'll see that later, but for example, if I'm building a 12 fret guitar, I typically might want the bridge to be 5 millimeters in front of the scale length, and the saddle would often be something like 1.5 millimeters behind the scale length at the first string position, and maybe something like 4 or 5, I'll just put 4 in there for now, at the 6th string position. So the slope of the saddle would mean that the 6th string is 4 millimeters behind the scale length. And I'm just putting those values in for now. They're reasonable to make sense of the rest of the spreadsheet. In particular, there are values down here at the bottom of this orange column which are quite useful. This first one shows the measurement from the nut to the front of the bridge, so gives the bridge position on the body. Once the neck is on, you can measure it. The nut to the front of the saddle at the first string position and the 6th string position. And these values mean that you can mark out the bridge for the saddle slot and cut it in the right place. I think that covers pretty much the left-hand side of the sheet, which I print out, which is largely based on the fret calculator. The right-hand side, which is still obscured, and I'm going to reveal in a moment, just has some more information which I use during the build. I refer to it all the time. It's stuck on my wall, and it's there to stop me making as many mistakes as I would do if I didn't have it. So we'll see that next. Here we are on the right-hand side of the sheet then, and you can see it's a mixture of values which I fill in, the green ones, as before. I think there are 10, and these are by and large taken from the design of the guitar, so the drawing if it's a new body shape, or the previous values if I've built it before. And there are some other values which are useful but calculated for me. There are some in yellow and 1 or 2 with special notes by them. So I'm going to fill in some values taken from the last guitar I made, which was a parlor guitar, just so you can see it, and then I'll talk about the other ones which I don't fill in but which are done for me. I'll do that afterwards. So for the last guitar, the body depth at the heel was 88 millimeters, at the tail was 95, the distance from the heel around to the waist along the side was 255, and going the opposite way from the tail of the guitar around the side to the waist was 425, and the width of the lower bout was 310. The final actual fret on the fretboard was the 19th, and you can see some values down here changing as I fill stuff in, but I'll talk about that in a moment. The diameter of the sound hole was 88. The distance up along the center line from the tail to the center of the sound hole was 303, and the length of the whole body along the center line was 461, and from the tail to the waist along the center line was 282. So that basically completes all the information that I would put in. Looking at some of the calculated values in this lower part, these basically come from the fret calculation bit on the left hand side, which we've already seen, but they're useful to know while you're actually building. So the distance from the 1st to the 12th or the 1st to the 14th is that's so the 1st fret to the join, in other words, and also the 1st fret to the nominal scale length, the join to the scale length, the join, so the top of the body to the front of the bridge, which means you can place the bridge just on the body without using the neck measurement. And I don't know, for completeness sake, I put the 12th to the front of the bridge. The 12th, when it's the join fret, obviously those two values will be the same, but not if it's a 14 fret guitar. These lower values have been calculated as I filled in the values above. So the join to the center of the sound hole, once it knows where the sound hole is relative to the tail, it can calculate where it is relative to the top of the guitar. The join to the final actual fret, join to the end of the fingerboard, that's assuming that the fingerboard ends at where the next fret would be after the final one. So you can mark on the body where the end of the fingerboard would be. And the tail to the scale length. Again, it's some of these measurements are just sort of reality checks, if you like, just so you can double check something using a second measurement to make sure you haven't messed up on the first measurement. First string front of saddle to the front of the bridge, and the 6th string, same thing. So that basically defines the slope of the saddle and how you should mark out the saddle on the bridge once you've got it in the right place. One of the sort of safety nets which I've put in place is this one here, which is basically so these two values are from the waist up to the top of the guitar and down to the bottom, and from those it calculates the length of the side, so you know how long a piece of wood you need to make your side out of. But I've got a note to allow an extra length of half the fingerboard width for the non-cutaway side of a cutaway guitar, so that it can go all the way to the edge of the cutaway side, in other words, so behind the neck heel. If it's a non-cutaway guitar, obviously you get half from each side and the join's in the middle, but on a cutaway guitar the join is right on the edge of the fingerboard. Now there are some other values here which you can see I've noted are taken from the fingerboard taper sheet. There's 2 here and 1 down here. So next we'll have a look at that sheet, which is quite simple, and you'll see when I've input what I need to there, the values back in this sheet will be filled in for me automatically. Here at the bottom of the screen you can see the various tabs for the worksheets in the workbook, and I'm going to click on Fingerboard Taper in a moment but just to explain why this bit is still blurred out, why you haven't seen it, is the only reason is because it's a work table. It's not any useful information, but it's necessary for all the fret calculations. It's just tabulating values of the 12th rooted 2, successive values, which obviously is what's used in the calculation of fret sizes. So I'm going to go and click on Fingerboard Taper, and this bit is still blurred out, but it doesn't matter because it's empty anyway. So this is what it looks like, and you can see there's just a very few values to put in here. I start with the fingerboard width of the nut. Oh, I should say the scale length and the join fret have been filled in from the other sheet because I put them in there, so the values are carried over from that into this sheet. So I'm going to enter the fingerboard width of the nut, which was 46 millimeters, and the values for the string to the fingerboard edge at the first fret, so the gap between the string and the fingerboard edge, allowing for string bending and what have you. 3 millimeters. I'll put 3 for both. And I normally, from the design of the guitar, I know what the string spacing is, and I think for my last guitar it was 56.5 millimeters. And then the software calculates what the fingerboard width at the join fret would be. So in this case the join fret is the 12th, and you can see 54.2, and that's reflected up here. If the join fret had been the 14th, the value in this cell would be 55.1. But now you can see, if we go back to the main sheet, those values will be put in to this sheet. So the fingerboard width of the nut, I filled that in myself. Fingerboard width of the join was calculated, and the string spacing of the bridge, again, I put it in myself. So but as far as this sheet's concerned, it's a value that's carried over from another sheet. The fingerboard width of the join is filled in, and the fingerboard width of the final fret is also there, which can be useful again when you're building. So we're nearly there for the information on this worksheet in the sense that I use it in the workshop. There's just one which comes in much later in the process, actually. You see this value here, bridge height -3, it makes no sense. The value is taken from the bridge height sheet. I'll show you it very briefly now, just so you can see why I say it's much later in the process. The sheet looks like this, and basically when I've made the fretboard, and I can bolt it onto the neck, and when it's got the frets in and the frets are more or less leveled, I measure the gap under if I take a line along the frets using a long ruler and then measure down to the top at the position of the scale length, I measure that gap, and it could be something like, 12 millimeters, about half an inch. And I fill in the action at the first fret, so the playing action that I want, the action at the 12th fret, the cloudy factor, which is the term I learned when I was first building a guitar, which is basically just the amount that the neck pulls up due to string tension. And you factor that in, and it's a sort of arbitrary value, but it's small anyway, something like, it's less than half a millimeter. So, and the only other value in this is the desired saddle height above the bridge, which normally I limit to about 3 millimeters, depending. Anyway, that explains why this value is still nonsense. But later on in the build process, I'll get to the stage where I can fill in those values on the bridge height sheet, and then okay, I'll have that as a reference in front of me, even though I've only put it in myself on the other sheet. It's all about having the maximum amount of useful information on one page. And you can argue that this may or may not be all that useful, or there should be other bits and pieces that should be there. But anyway, I find it useful like this. So that was it for this sheet, which, as I said at the beginning, is basically just an information sheet which I have stuck on the wall when I'm building, and I can refer to easily and quickly for whatever I might need. I mentioned that it had evolved over the years and basically expanded, but making this video has made me realise that there's more to do. There's some duplicated information. I've got the fingerboard width at the nut and the join twice, up here and down here. And down here I've added the fingerboard width at the final fret, which again is quite a useful value to have. But I don't need these two twice, so I'm going to take out one copy, which gives me 2 cells of space to put something else useful in. Obviously I've got tons of space elsewhere, but I could put loads and loads of information in, but I wanted to keep it fairly condensed and focused on what I need when I'm building. So I'll try and think of things which I have needed which weren't on the sheet, on this sheet. But if anybody's got any suggestions for a couple of useful values that could go in instead of the redundant stuff here, then please put them in the comments below. I'll do a second video at some point on the Dennis spreadsheet, which, as you've seen, is partly input into this sheet. But it's quite nice because it does a little drawing of the saddle. It calculates the saddle slope and the positions of the breakpoints for each string on the nut and the saddle. So it's a separate thing. It's partly input to this sheet, but it's also a useful sheet as workbook in its own right. So that'll be my Excel in my guitar making part 2. So until then, goodbye for now.